blood-soaked fields where brothers cut down brothers. For 30 years, two royal houses, York's White Rose and Lancaster's Red, ripped England apart in a brutal struggle for the crown. Nobles changed sides as easily as they changed armor. Kings rose and fell in the span of a heartbeat. Edward IV won by brilliance, Richard III by ruthlessness, and Henry Tudor by patience. The war that reshaped a kingdom would one day become the inspiration for books and acclaimed television. Yet even fiction could never capture the truth of how England learned to kill for power and how it learned to live with the cost. Long before fiction dreamt of dragons and thrones, England lived the tale itself. The struggle that would one day inspire Game of Thrones began not in fantasy, but in flesh, born of royal pride, family betrayal, and a crown that passed from one blood-stained hand to another. In the 14th century, the realm of England glittered beneath Edward III, a king who ruled as if history itself had chosen him. His court shimmered with banners and iron, poets and warriors, all convinced they stood at the summit of Christendom. Yet the brilliance of Edward's reign hid a quiet peril. He had sired too many sons. Each bore a measure of the royal flame. Each believed destiny might be his. From that abundance of princes came the seeds of a war that would one day burn the nation bare. Among those sons, two would shape the future like opposing stars. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. Their blood would outlive them, dividing the descendants of Edward into rival claimants to the same divine inheritance. Gaunt's line, proud and prolific, gave birth to the House of Lancaster, Langley's to the House of York. For a century, these names would remain kin, sharing tables, wars, and marriages. Yet kinship in royal houses is rarely peace. 'Tis kindling, waiting for a spark. John of Gaunt was no ordinary prince. His estate stretched across England like veins of gold, and his ambition reached still farther. Through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, he acquired lands so vast that they rivaled the crown itself. When she died, he took as his companion the woman who would change the course of England's fate, Catherine Swynford, the daughter of a minor knight, his mistress, and later his wife. Their children, the Beauforts, were born of devotion, not diplomacy. When Gaunt petitioned the Pope to legitimize them, the church consented. But Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, who would one day be Henry IV, added a cruel postscript. Though the Beauforts were lawful, they and their heirs were forever barred from the throne. It was a single sentence, a line of ink that would echo like thunder. The Beauforts were royal, yet forbidden, pure, yet blemished. From that contradiction would come the ambition of Margaret Beaufort and, in time, her son Henry Tudor, the final player in the long War of Roses. While the Beauforts grew in influence, the king's other descendants scattered across Europe and England, marrying, scheming, and waiting for their chance. The crown, however, rested still with Edward's grandson, a child named Richard. The Black Prince, Edward's heroic heir, had died before his father, leaving behind a boy of tender years. When the old king passed in 1377, the boy was crowned Richard II, precocious, intelligent, and already convinced of his divinity. He saw kingship not as stewardship, but as sacrament, and England soon tired of holiness in place of governance. Richard's reign drifted into arrogance and suspicion. Nobles whispered against him, and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke watched with the patience of a serpent. When Richard banished him, the act seemed final. Yet death has a habit of calling kings from their thrones. In 1399, while Richard campaigned in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned with a small host. claiming only the restoration of his father's lands. England rose to him like a weary friend. By the year's end, the child of the Black Prince was deposed, imprisoned, and left to die. Some said starved, others smothered. Bolingbroke crowned himself Henry IV, first of the Lancastrian kings. It was an act of calculated defiance. The crown no longer passed through the sacred rhythm of inheritance. It was now seized by strength. The divine right of kings had been replaced by the practical right of the sword. England would never forget that. Every son of York and Lancaster would measure himself against that theft, believing that the crown could be taken, not merely born to. The early Lancastrian years glittered with promise and violence. Henry IV survived rebellions and disease, but he died worn by guilt. His son, Henry V, became the model of kingly virtue, fierce, intelligent, and pious in equal measure. The fields of Agincourt turned him into legend, the saviour who conquered France and brought the lilies into the English coat of arms. Under him, the nation felt invincible. The blood of Plantagenet kings seemed sanctified again. But legend is fragile. Henry V died young in 1422, leaving his 9-month-old son heir to both England and France. That child would reign as Henry VI, a boy born into impossible expectation. In him, the grandeur of his forebears curdled into sanctity. He was gentle where they were bold, meek where they had been magnificent. Scholars later said he might have been a saint had he not been a king. But England did not need a saint. It needed a ruler. The century that followed Edward III's death was one of haunting irony. The mightiest monarchy in Europe had become a fragile web of cousins, clerics, and claimants. The nobility, swollen by royal favour, began to act as sovereigns in miniature, each a warlord cloaked in courtesy. Feuds erupted in the shires, inheritance disputes turned to sieges, and royal justice was sold to the highest bidder. Beneath the ceremonies of chivalry, England was rotting. Still, in the great halls of Westminster and Windsor, courtiers pretended the world was sound. They toasted the child king and whispered prayers that God would guide him. But across the Channel, the dream of empire was slipping away. French forces clawed back Normandy, Gascony, and Maine. English soldiers, once the pride of Agincourt, returned home destitute, their loyalty for sale to whichever lord could feed them. An entire generation of armed men, hardened by a century of continental war, found no peace in the land that birthed them. They became retainers, mercenaries, bandits, the future armies of the Wars of the Roses. John of Gaunt was long dead, but his bloodline, the House of Lancaster, ruled England through his descendant, Henry VI. Edmund of Langley's heirs, the House of York, waited in silence. Among them was Richard, Duke of York, descended not only from Edward III's fifth son, but also from Lionel of Antwerp, the king's second. By strict lineage, Richard's claim was stronger than that of the gentle monarch who wore the crown. As long as Henry produced no heir, that truth hung over the realm, like a sword suspended by a single hair. And so the century closed as it had begun, with a king too holy to rule, and a cousin too proud to serve. The court murmured of miracles and madness. Priests spoke of divine trials, soldiers of unpaid wages. Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce and French, began to harden her husband's rule by her own will. The kingdom's heart divided, one half devoted to sanctity, the other to strength. Few yet spoke of roses. That emblem would come later, when the realm needed symbols to explain its sins. For now, there were only colours: the deep crimson of Lancaster's banner, the pale white of York's. From the height of Edward's empire to the frailty of Henry's peace stretched a single unbroken thread: ambition disguised as duty. The men who would die for their houses were still unborn. The women who would move kings like pieces on a board were still learning to walk. But the game had already begun. The Beauforts bore their curse quietly, barred yet royal. The Yorkists watched and waited. And England, restless, pious, and proud, trembled on the edge of awakening. History would remember it as the beginning of a civil war. But in truth, it was a family quarrel that forgot how to end. There are moments when a kingdom seems to lose its mind through the mind of its king. In Henry VI, England met its mirror, gentle, devout, and incapable of cruelty, and therefore unfit to survive. The boy who inherited 2 crowns at 9 months old, England and France together, grew into a man who could not hold one. Where his father had ruled by the sword, Henry ruled by prayer. Yet faith is a fragile foundation for government, and the realm that adored saints soon longed again for soldiers. The king's early years unfolded under guardians who wore patience as a mask for power. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the last of the warrior uncles, thundered for war in France, while Cardinal Beaufort whispered for peace. Between them, England was stretched to breaking, one hand clutching the past glories of Agincourt, the other groping for treaties and dowries. Each victory abroad seemed to drain the realm at home. Taxes rose, tempers flared, and loyalty curdled into rivalry. By 1450, the empire Henry V had carved in France began to crumble to dust. Normandy was gone. Gascony followed 3 years later. The loss was more than territory. It was pride, identity, the very memory of conquest. Ships ferried home the wreckage of a century of war. Thousands of archers and men-at-arms, trained for slaughter and now unemployed. They wandered the shires in torn livery, half heroes, half vagrants, selling their blades to any lord with coin, enough to keep them fed. England, thick with idle soldiers, became an arsenal without a keeper. Amid this decay, the court glimmered like a fragile reliquary. The young king's eyes were soft, his voice mild. Courtiers said he blushed to sign a death warrant. His piety drew admiration from monks and mockery from men who bled for wages. Yet one person looked on him not with pity, but with purpose. Margaret of Anjou, the bride sent from France in a peace pact that promised amity and brought ruin. She arrived at 15, a girl with iron in her spine. Her marriage cost England the last fragments of its French lands, a dowry paid in humiliation. But Margaret brought something rarer than gold: will. Where Henry yielded, she commanded. Where he prayed, she plotted. The court soon learned that to offend the queen was to court extinction. Beneath her gaze, factions sprouted like weeds. On one side, the House of Lancaster, the Beauforts, the Somersets, the loyalists to Henry's blood. On the other, the silent watchers, the Yorkists, whose claim to the throne was older, though unspoken. At their head stood Richard, Duke of York, tall, confident, and weary of compromise. He had served as lieutenant in France, governed Ireland, and returned home to find himself discarded in favour of the Queen's favourite, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a cousin through that once barred Beaufort line. To York, the insult was intolerable. To the realm, it was dangerous. Somerset's failures in France had already cost England half its possessions. Now, his influence at court threatened what little stability remained. Margaret shielded him, Henry adored him, the nobles despised him. The kingdom trembled as whispers turned to riots. London merchants cursed unpaid debts. Peasants muttered of corruption. In 1450, an uprising led by a man calling himself Jack Cade marched on the capital. He claimed loyalty to the king, but demanded justice against his evil councillors. His followers looted the city before being cut down in the streets. Cade's body swung from a gibbet, but his words lingered. The king's law is lost, his people betrayed. When Richard of York returned from Ireland soon after, England's conscience seemed to return with him. He swore that he sought not the crown, but the country's salvation. Yet every oath of loyalty sounded like rehearsal for rebellion. Then came the silence. In the summer of 1453, messengers rode through the kingdom with a single devastating truth. At Castillon in Gascony, the last English army had been annihilated. Bordeaux had fallen. The 100 Years' War was over, lost. England's empire was gone, and with it went the king's reason. Contemporaries said that Henry VI heard the news and fell still. He spoke to no one, moved for no one. He sat for months in a kind of holy trance, pale and vacant, as if his soul had gone in search of his father's ghost. Councillors whispered prayers and feared contagion, for madness in a monarch spreads faster than plague. During this vacancy of the throne, the Queen gave birth to a son, a miracle to some, a menace to others. Many wondered whose child the infant truly was, for the king's mind had been absent almost a year. Yet Margaret proclaimed him Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the house of Lancaster, and gathered the northern lords to her cause. Her motherhood became her crown. Meanwhile, Richard of York was summoned to London. With the king insensible and the realm dissolving into private war, Parliament had little choice but to appoint him protector of the realm. For 9 months he ruled in Henry's name, restoring some semblance of order, trimming the Queen's influence and exiling Somerset to the Tower. But stability under one man's hand was insecurity for all others. The nobles watched him as they once had watched Bolingbroke, wondering whether duty might again turn to usurpation. At Christmas 1454, the miracle came, or the curse. The king awoke. He looked upon his infant son, blessed him, and asked after his queen as though he had merely been asleep. The court wept with relief. The protectorate dissolved overnight. Somerset walked free. York bowed, outwardly obedient, inwardly calculating. England exhaled, but the breath was poison. The months of paralysis had unmasked every ambition in the realm. Margaret had tasted power and would never surrender it. York had held command and could not forget it. The nobles who had chosen sides could no longer plead neutrality. The balance was broken, and all that remained was the reckoning. Through the early months of 1455, the Queen's faction gathered in the north, summoning levies, while York and his allies, the Nevilles of Warwick and Salisbury, armed in the south. Both declared themselves loyal to the king, both prepared to kill in his name. On May 22nd, their armies met in the market streets of St. Albans. England's first civil battle in generations lasted less than an hour. Arrows clattered against timbered walls. Merchants hid behind counters as swords rang in the lanes. When the smoke cleared, the Duke of Somerset lay dead, his blood soaking the cobbles beneath the sign of the Castle Inn. The king himself was found wounded in a tanner's cottage, his crown spattered with his own blood. Richard of York knelt before him, assuring that his quarrel had been only with Somerset, never with the throne. Henry, dazed and bleeding, forgave him. The Queen did not. England had crossed a line it would never recross. The battle had killed scarcely 100 men. yet it tore apart the moral fabric of the kingdom. Cousins had slain cousins, and the king's peace had been broken by those sworn to defend it. The roses had not yet become emblems, but already the colours were fixed. Lancaster red for loyalty, York white for order. In the hush that followed St. Albans, Richard of York was again named protector. Henry retreated into piety. Margaret retreated into rage. The court turned on itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. Across the shires, armed retainers drilled in barns and churchyards, sharpening blades for masters they scarcely knew. The old feudal bonds, service, faith, obedience, had dissolved into private oaths of survival. The shadow of madness had passed from the king to the realm, and beneath that shadow, men began to dream not of peace, but of inheritance. The year 1455 opened with the quiet dread of a country waiting for thunder. For months the nobles had ridden through the valleys, gathering men, not yet calling it war. The banners of York and Lancaster were still the colours of cousins, not yet of enemies. But every messenger who crossed the roads carried more than letters. He carried the scent of steel. Richard of York had returned to favour after the king's collapse, yet peace was only the pause between two breaths. Queen Margaret's hatred for him had ripened into purpose. She would see her son's inheritance guarded by force if need be, and in that resolve she found allies among those who owed their fortunes to her grace. The Duke of Somerset was gone, but his death had left behind widows, sons, and a ledger of vengeance. Across the Midlands, retainers hammered rust from helmets and cut new arrowheads. Lords who had once met at feast tables now kept to their fortresses, sending cautious envoys to one another by night. The people called it arming for honour, though they knew what honour looked like when it was stripped of coin and pity. In May, the royal summons arrived for a council at St. Albans. The letter spoke of reconciliation, of restoring unity, yet everyone who read it heard the unspoken words beneath, "Come armed." Richard of York rode south with the Earls of Warwick and Salisbury at his side, each followed by a column of men in livery, white roses embroidered on their sleeves, sunlight catching on the points of their pikes. The king travelled from London beneath the scarlet standards of Lancaster, accompanied by the Queen's household knights and the sons of those who had fallen at Somerset's side. At dawn on the 22nd of May, two armies stood staring across the narrow streets of the market town. Between them hung the flags of compromise, bright in the morning light and already meaningless. York sent envoys declaring that his loyalty to the monarch was unbroken, that he sought only to remove traitorous advisers from the royal presence. The answer came back simple and cold. Lay down your arms or be deemed a rebel. The wind shifted. The silence tore. Arrows hissed through the timbered lanes, slamming into shop fronts and doorposts. Townsfolk fled into cellars as soldiers pressed forward, hacking through stalls and draperies. The fighting was fierce and confused, more a riot than a battle. Warwick, young and reckless, found a way around the barricades by cutting through back gardens and breaching the marketplace. The defenders, pinned between converging lines, began to crumble. When the din subsided, 3 great lords of the Lancastrian party lay dead: Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford. Their bodies were dragged from the blood-slick cobbles, stripped of armour, and displayed beneath the sign of the Castle Inn. The monarch himself had taken an arrow wound to the neck and had sought shelter in a tanner's hut, trembling yet composed, as though his own injury mattered less than the horror of it all. York entered that cottage unhelmed, knelt and begged forgiveness. He swore that he had fought not against his sovereign, but against corruption. the sovereign, pale and bleeding, forgave him without hesitation. The Queen was not there to object, and England's first battle between kin ended with a kneeling victor and a captive ruler. It was a strange triumph. No crown changed hands, no cities fell. Yet the air itself seemed altered. The sacred bond between monarch and subject, between law and loyalty, had been torn open. Every household in the realm would feel the draught that blew through that wound. In London, the bells rang to announce that order had been restored. Merchants reopened their shops. Clerks copied new proclamations bearing York's seal as protector of the realm. But beneath the calm surface, rumour moved like fever. The widows of St. Albans began to petition the Queen for justice, and Margaret's grief hardened into weaponry. She had lost her friends, her honour, and, in her eyes, her husband's obedience. From that day, she would fight not for governance, but for survival. Through the summer, the Protector ruled with a steadiness that almost convinced the people the storm had passed. Laws were enforced, debts collected, pirates hanged at the quays. Yet even as order returned, the great families were measuring one another's strength. The northern lords, the Percys, the Cliffords' kin, swore vengeance. In the Midlands, Lancastrian banners began to appear at musters disguised as tournaments. The red rose, once only a decoration on seals and signet rings, now stood for allegiance. Beyond the Channel, exiled knights whispered that the Queen of France had sent her niece to England to tame it. Now that niece was gathering armies like a second Joan of Arc. Margaret's letters to Scotland promised alliance, marriage and gold if the border clans would rise in her defence. Richard of York watched these currents from his fortress at Ludlow. He knew the peace could not last, yet he also understood that open war would brand him a traitor. The king, restored to health but weakened by guilt, drifted between Windsor and Westminster, speaking little. Chroniclers later said he wandered palace corridors at night, murmuring psalms while the torches guttered, a man haunted by his own forgiveness. The court, now split clean through, performed its duties in pantomime. When York entered the council chamber, half the lords stood. When the Queen entered, the other half did. Between them, the monarch sat in stillness, his crown gleaming like a relic of another age. Late that year, York travelled north to mediate a dispute between the Neville and Percy families, a feud that had already spilled blood across the shires. It was there, among smoking manors and broken villages, that he saw what the kingdom had become. Not a nation, but a collection of private armies. Each noble now held his own court, his own prison, his own gallows. Royal justice had become a rumour. By winter, the illusion of peace was threadbare. Margaret summoned her adherents to Coventry for a great council, which the Yorkists rightly read as a trap. Orders went out quietly for levies to assemble. Forged pardons were prepared, as every side planned to blame the other. When snow fell that December, the roads filled again with marching men. Pikes jutted above the hedgerows like thorns. Towns sealed their gates, fearing both sides equally. The realm that had conquered France now trembled before its own reflection. Chroniclers would later call St. Albans the first battle of the Wars of the Roses, though no one there spoke of roses. They spoke instead of cousins, conscience, and revenge. Yet the symbols would come soon enough, born of heraldry and hatred, until every soldier knew which flower he served and why he might die for it. For the moment, the victors celebrated their restraint. But restraint is a short-lived virtue in politics. Every head that fell at St. Albans would have sons, brothers, or fathers ready to repay the debt. Vengeance had found its rhythm, and it would not be silenced for 30 years. Richard of York stood at Windsor that Christmas beside the wounded monarch, watching snow drift against the chapel windows. He must have believed, or wished to believe, that reconciliation was still possible. The king murmured a prayer for peace. The duke's answer was silence, and silence by then was merely the breath before war. The first sparks had caught. Soon the whole kingdom would burn. After the skirmish at St. Albans, the realm pretended to heal. Parliament met, lords exchanged oaths, and for a fleeting season the roads were safe again. Yet the peace of 1456 was a peace of silence, not forgiveness, a pause between sword strokes. Each family counted its dead and polished its vengeance. The monarch sat at Windsor like a ghost restored to flesh. He prayed long hours, signed pardons, and tried to believe that grace could mend a kingdom. The queen believed otherwise. Margaret of Anjou had watched her husband bled and humbled. She would not see him ruled by those who had wounded him. If holiness had failed, cunning must prevail. She began to build her own power, the way a mason raises a fortress. Stone by stone, debt by debt, oath by oath. In the north, she found willing allies. The Percys nursed their feud with the Nevilles. Clifford's heir sharpened his sword for his father's killers. To them, the queen promised justice. To the crown, she promised strength. Soon, from Yorkshire to Durham, musters were being held under her banner. The red rose, still more rumour than emblem, started to bloom upon shields. Far to the south, Richard of York governed as protector for the second time. His hand was firm, his justice outwardly fair. He dismissed corrupt officials, calmed trade, and spoke of reconciliation in the tone of command. For a moment, it seemed as if order might return. But order enforced by a subject is tyranny in disguise. Every decision he made reminded the court that one man, not anointed, was ruling in the king's stead, and every letter Margaret sent northward whispered the same fear, that York meant to wear the crown he guarded. By the summer of 1456, the Queen had drawn her husband away from London to Kenilworth. There, surrounded by loyal households, she wove her court anew. Knights once dismissed were summoned back, their lands restored. New councillors, grateful to her, swore to serve only the royal household. The Protector's authority dissolved in stages, not revoked, merely ignored. When autumn came, York withdrew to Ludlow, claiming fatigue. Behind the pretext lay humiliation. For 3 years, the realm drifted. The Queen's faction ruled by charm and menace, the Yorkists by memory and hope. Private wars multiplied. Disputes over inheritance ended in sieges. Sheriffs took bribes from both sides and called it law. To common folk, it seemed the kingdom had become a field divided by invisible walls, each village belonging to one lord's quarrel or another's revenge. In the late months of 1459, Margaret struck her first open blow. She summoned a great council to Coventry, her chosen stronghold, and invited York and his allies to attend. The summons bore the seal of peace, but every messenger carried a whisper. The roads were lined with armed men. It was a trap too transparent to disguise. York refused to come. Instantly, he and his companions were declared traitors. From Ludlow, he answered with banners. The Duke of York called his sons to arms: Edward, Earl of March, and Edmund, Earl of Rutland. With them rode the old warriors, Salisbury and Warwick, whose family feud with the northern lords had become personal crusade. Across the Midlands they marched, gathering tenants and mercenaries, until the white rose seemed once again the emblem of salvation. They claimed loyalty to the monarch, as always, but denounced the Queen's advisors as the true enemies of peace. Their first meeting with the royal host came near Ludford Bridge. Night had fallen, mist curling over the river, when torches flared on the opposite bank. The king's banner gleamed faintly through the smoke. York's men hesitated. To fight there would mean rebellion against an anointed ruler, not merely against councillors. Then, in the small hours, betrayal finished what conscience had begun. The veterans from Calais, the only disciplined soldiers in York's ranks, slipped away under cover of darkness, declaring for the king. When dawn rose, the rebel camp was already breaking. York fled westward with his younger son to Ireland. His allies Warwick and Salisbury escaped across the Channel to Calais. Ludlow was left undefended. The victors entered the town as conquerors. Looting followed, drunken and cruel. Homes were ransacked, churches stripped, women taken. Even royal proclamations of clemency could not restrain the soldiers. The spectacle was meant to teach obedience, but instead taught hatred. Those who had marched beneath the white rose would remember the pillage as a promise of future revenge. In November, the Queen convened what chroniclers later named the Parliament of Devils at Coventry. It opened with ceremony and ended in vengeance. One by one, the absent Yorkists were condemned for treason. Their lands were confiscated, their heirs disinherited, their very names erased from prayer books. Such total ruin was unprecedented. No magnate could look on those sentences without fear. If fortune turned, who might not be next? Margaret, however, believed the danger finished. She had exiled her enemies, secured her son's inheritance, and re-established the monarchy's dignity. Her council toasted victory. Her heralds proclaimed that rebellion had been quenched. Yet triumph built on punishment is a fragile crown. The exiles were not broken, they were merely waiting beyond the sea. Winter closed in early that year. Across the Channel, Warwick trained his men amid the rain-slick streets of Calais, the only fortress still held by loyalists to the White Rose. Merchants of the staple funded him, for his patrols kept the Channel free of pirates. When he sailed out under Yorkist colours, the sea captains hailed him as the guardian of commerce, not the foe of kings. It was a fiction everyone was willing to believe. On the Irish coast, Richard of York found refuge among old allies. There he issued proclamations of loyalty, blaming all disorder on false counsellors and malicious whisperers. The words were ritual, but the meaning was clear. When the season turned, he would return in force. Exile had stripped him of office, not ambition. Back in the royal court, the Queen's triumph began to sour. Taxes rose to pay her armies. Merchants grumbled at seizures. Southern lords refused northern garrisons entry. The monarch himself grew restless, haunted by guilt over the blood at Ludford. He spoke of reconciliation, but his voice no longer commanded obedience. Every pardon he granted undid a threat Margaret had made. Between their councils lay a chasm wider than the river Severn. In the spring of 1460, reports reached London that Warwick's fleet had captured several royal ships near Sandwich. Soon after, Kentish ports began to harbour strange vessels, their holds packed with armour and men. The Queen dismissed the rumours as invention. The council grew uneasy. The realm had seen exiles return before, but never with such quiet determination. For now, however, the scene belongs to the victors. The crown gleamed upon Henry's head once more. The Queen stood beside him, her child in her arms. Her enemies scattered to wind and water. At Coventry's feast, she raised a cup and vowed that no subject would ever again threaten her husband's peace. Outside the hall, the torches burned low in the damp air, and the guards shifted uneasily in the shadows. They could not know that within a year the exiles would land again. The red and white banners would face each other across the fields, and the war that had no name would become a legend. Certain of her triumph, the Queen let her guard slip, and perhaps she had, for one winter. But rebellion is a flame that feeds upon pride, and pride was plentiful in every noble heart. Soon the tide would turn, and the woman who ruled a kingdom would be forced to fight for her crown upon the snow. When spring returned in 1460, it carried the scent of the sea and the whisper of sails. From Calais came the exiles, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, his father Salisbury, and York's eldest son, Edward of March. They landed at Sandwich under banners newly stitched and newly defiant. The same people who had cursed them as traitors now hailed them as deliverers. The Queen's taxes had made patriots of her enemies. The invaders moved quickly. Within days, Kent's ports opened to them. The merchants of London sent quiet promises of support. Every shipmaster owed Warwick favours from his years guarding the Channel. When he marched through Canterbury, villagers lined the roads, offering bread, ale, and gossip. They said he was the only man alive who could keep the island safe. Far to the north, Margaret's faction hesitated. The monarch remained passive, unwilling to summon another army. The Queen's envoys spoke of loyalty while their soldiers deserted. By July, the white rose had bloomed again on the capital's gates. York's supporters entered London without a sword drawn. The bells rang as if for coronation. They proclaimed allegiance to Henry VI, but demanded the removal of false counsellors, a phrase that by now meant anyone who stood between them and the throne. While Warwick held the city, York's eldest son advanced northward, mustering men from the shires. The young earl had inherited his father's height and his mother's fierce composure. Those who saw him ride said he looked born for a crown he did not yet claim. Before summer ended, the roads were thick with his followers. Farmers armed with billhooks, yeomen in quilted jacks, household retainers in livery stitched with the white bloom of York. At Northampton, the royal host gathered to block his path. Rain poured for 3 days. The ground turned to mire. Thunder rolled over the tents like drums of warning. The king's army outnumbered the rebels, and behind its lines, the red banners of Lancaster hung sodden but proud. On the morning of July 10th, the heavens opened again, and the two sides met. Arrows darkened the sky, but the rain spoiled the powder in the king's guns. When the Duke of Norfolk's men waded through the mud, they found the royal camp in confusion. A sudden cry, treachery, rose as Lord Grey of Ruthin defected mid-battle, throwing open the barricades. Within minutes, the fight was over. The monarch was taken prisoner in his own pavilion, his crown undisturbed, but his authority gone. In the fallen camp, Warwick ordered mercy. The captives were to be treated as subjects, not enemies. The field at Northampton was a victory of strategy, not slaughter, and that made it all the more terrifying. With the monarch in custody, Warwick escorted him back to London, seated beneath the royal canopy as if the battle had been a pageant. Crowds cheered, uncertain whom they hailed. The Queen fled north with her son, gathering what allies she could among the border lords. The realm had split cleanly in two, government in the south under Yorkist control, resistance in the north under Margaret's name. In the capital, Parliament convened under Warwick's watch. On the benches where courtiers once whispered of pageantry, now sat soldiers smelling of damp and blood. When Richard of York returned from Ireland that autumn, he entered Westminster Hall as though the matter were already settled. His sword was borne upright before him. His banner hung alongside the royal arms. He walked the length of the chamber and laid his hand upon the vacant throne. No one moved. The silence stretched. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury, his voice trembling, asked, Do you seek to see the king, my lord?" York turned, eyes bright with certainty. "I know of no man whose right is above mine." It was a claim spoken in calmness, but heard as thunder. Even his allies hesitated. To unseat the monarch was treason. To leave him on the throne invited chaos. The peers withdrew for counsel. When they returned, they offered a compromise that history would remember as the Act of Accord. The measure declared that Henry VI would remain ruler for life, but that Richard of York and his heirs would inherit the crown upon the monarch's death. In a single sentence, the king's son, Prince Edward of Wales, was disinherited. The Queen's rage at this decree could have melted iron. She swore that her boy's birthright would be defended to the last heartbeat in her body. From her refuge in the north, she summoned every man who still bore loyalty to Lancaster. Nobles who had lost kin at St. Albans and Northampton answered her call with zeal. The air grew thick with prophecy, that a woman would conquer where men had failed. By December, her host was moving south, a tide of hardened soldiers and vengeful widowers. York rode to meet them, though winter was deep and his numbers thin. He was joined by his ally Salisbury and his second son, Edmund of Rutland, barely 17. At Sandal Castle near Wakefield, he waited for reinforcements that never came. The enemy, led by Somerset's heir, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, encamped within sight of the walls. Snow fell, muting the sound of drums. Inside, the Duke studied the frozen fields and believed the enemy weaker than rumour claimed. On the last days of December, he chose to strike. Whether he was lured out by false reports or by pride, none can tell. He led his men down the slope and into a storm of arrows. The trap closed around him. Lancastrian banners rose from every hedge and hollow. The battle was short and merciless. York's forces broke. His son Edmund tried to flee across the bridge and was cut down. Salisbury was captured alive. The victor's cruelty turned victory into spectacle. York's head was set upon a pike above the gates of the city that bore his name, a paper crown nailed mockingly to his brow. Beside him soon hung the heads of his son and his ally. The Queen's commanders paraded the grisly trophies through the streets, proclaiming that justice had been done for Somerset, for Clifford, for every lord slain at St. Albans. When news reached London, even those who had envied the Duke were struck silent. A century of war in France had not produced such vengeance upon English soil. The white rose, once a sign of reform, had become a martyr's emblem. Among the Yorkist ranks that survived, grief hardened into something colder than loyalty. In the marches, young Edward gathered the remnants of his father's army. The soldiers called him the Rose of Rouen, for he had been born in exile there and carried himself like a prince from legend. In his campfires, men spoke of retribution, not rebellion. The Queen's triumph had been absolute, yet the taste of blood on the wind foretold its brevity. Vengeance in this kingdom never belonged to one house for long. Winter deepened. The monarch, ever pliant, sent letters of thanksgiving for the restoration of peace. But no one believed in peace any longer. The Queen rode north again, her son beside her, her army swelling with each mile. Behind her, the frozen fields of Wakefield bore witness to the end of one generation and the beginning of another. Some chroniclers later claimed that as her soldiers fixed the paper crown on York's severed head, Margaret smiled. Others insisted she turned away in pity. History cannot tell which is true, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that the act became myth. Every child who grew up in the years that followed would know the tale of the Duke who died for his claim and the woman who mocked him. That story retold in whispers, would keep the hatred alive long after both lay in their graves. The Queen had avenged her honor, but in doing so, she had made her enemies immortal. Beyond the hills, Edward of March was already preparing his answer, a youth armed with destiny and the loyalty of men who no longer believed in saints. Though the white rose was broken and buried in snow, its roots kept breathing in the cold. By spring, they would bloom again, and the realm would find that nothing is more dangerous than a cause reborn in defeat. Winter, 1461, was cruel beyond memory. Roads vanished under snow, rivers froze solid, and armies stumbled through fields that cracked beneath their boots. The air itself seemed to whisper vengeance. The Duke of York was dead, his head blackening above the gates of the city that bore his name. And his 19-year-old son had sworn before the soldiers of the marches that his father's cause would not die with him. Edward of March had none of his father's caution and all of his will. He was tall as a spear, broad-shouldered, and already beloved by men who had no reason left to love anything. Around him gathered fugitives and veterans, the broken survivors of Wakefield, men who had seen their kin butchered and now sought only to repay the debt. He spoke to them not as noble to follower, but as one of their own. "If we must perish," he said, "let it be with our faces north." At dawn on Candlemas Day, February the 2nd, his scouts brought word that Jasper Tudor and the Earl of Wiltshire were marching from Wales with a force twice his size. The two hosts met near Mortimer's Cross, close to the borderlands where Edward had grown up. Frost glittered on every hedge. The air was sharp enough to taste. As the young commander rode along his line, the sky kindled with an omen. 3 suns blazing side by side through the icy haze. The soldiers murmured in fear until he laughed and raised his sword. "Behold," he cried, "the symbol of the Trinity, 3 lights joined in one. So shall our cause stand against its enemies." They took heart, and the omen became his badge, the sun in splendor. When the trumpets sounded, the marchmen advanced through mist and hail, driving back the enemy with ferocity born of despair. By dusk, the Lancastrian army lay shattered. Owen Tudor, father to Jasper and grandfather to the Prince of Wales, was captured and beheaded in Hereford marketplace. His head was set on the steps of the cathedral, the face smiling faintly, as if even death found the jest bitter. Edward's victory at Mortimer's Cross transformed him from avenger to commander. He marched east, linking forces with Warwick, whose retreat from the Second Battle of St. Albans had left the capital unguarded. The Queen's army had recaptured the king, but the triumph was hollow. Her northern troops, unpaid and half-starved, plundered towns as they went. By the time Margaret reached York, the south already whispered her name with dread. In March, Edward and Warwick entered London to the sound of church bells and cannon salutes. The city, weary of sack and terror, hailed the young earl as saviour. The monarch had vanished again into his wife's keeping. The people began to speak of new rule. In council, the lords debated whether the Act of Accord had perished with the late duke. Some argued that the promise to York bound the crown to his heirs. Others murmured of treason. Edward himself said little. He simply reminded them that a kingdom could not live in captivity to a queen's ambition. On March the 4th, at Westminster, the Archbishop proclaimed him King Edward IV by right of blood and conquest. The assembly raised a shout that rolled through the nave like thunder. Within days, the city accepted him as ruler in truth as well as name. From the Tower, he issued commands under his own seal, summoning the armies of the south to meet the enemy who still held the north. Meanwhile, Margaret gathered her strength for one last stand. Her host was immense, perhaps 40,000 men, commanded by the seasoned lords of Lancaster, Somerset's heir, Northumberland's son, Clifford's cousin, all burning to avenge their fathers. The Queen herself rode among them, her young prince beside her, promising gold, land, and glory. The two forces met near the village of Towton on Palm Sunday, March the 29th. Snow swept the plain in blinding gusts. The wind blew hard from the south into the faces of the Red Rose army. Edward's archers, better placed and better supplied, loosed volley after volley, each arrow carried farther by the storm. When the enemy advanced uphill, they found themselves walking into a rain of iron. The battle raged for 10 hours, the longest single day of killing the island had ever seen. Blades dulled, hands slipped on frozen blood. Men fought knee-deep in slush, grappling with bare fists when weapons broke. Warwick's cavalry charged through the blizzard. Norfolk's reinforcements arrived at sunset to strike the fatal blow. The rout that followed turned the snowfield into a river of corpses. Chroniclers claimed 28,000 dead. Brothers, fathers, cousins, neighbors. The flower of 2 generations cut down in a single afternoon. When night fell, the wind dropped and silence returned. Edward walked among the bodies, face streaked with grime and tears. He had won, but the price of victory was the ruin of half the nobility. The Wars of the Roses had become more than a struggle of houses. It had become a reckoning for the realm itself. In the weeks that followed, the new king rode north to consolidate his rule. York opened its gates. The heads of his father and brother were taken down and buried with honour. The lords who survived swore allegiance, some in fear, others in hope of favour. To those who bent the knee, Edward showed remarkable mercy. Only the worst offenders met the block. His policy was simple: peace through pardon, loyalty through reward. The Queen, her husband, and her son fled first to Scotland, then across the sea to France, seeking aid from King Louis XI. Henry VI, gentle and bewildered, wandered between sanctuaries, a prisoner to his own crown. Margaret's letters to the French court promised anything: gold, ports, even Calais, if only an army might be lent. For a time, she was ignored. Even foreign kings had grown weary of English quarrels. In London, the young ruler began to govern. The capital rejoiced at his energy, his beauty, his promise of order. Merchants reopened their stalls, trade resumed, the treasury filled. Yet beneath the banners and processions lay exhaustion. Every village had buried its sons. Every family bore a feud. The new monarch's first task was not expansion, but repair. He rode through the shires, dispensing justice with a soldier's impatience. When 2 claimants pleaded over a manor, he ordered them to split the rents and share the wine. Better a divided estate than a divided country, he said, and the courtiers repeated it as wisdom. He hunted, laughed, gambled, and ruled as if war itself were an old nightmare from which the kingdom had finally woken. But nightmares are patient things. Across the Channel, Margaret of Anjou plotted her return. In the shadows of Westminster, lords who had changed sides once considered whether they might do so again. Warwick, the great Kingmaker, found himself less trusted than before. And among the mercenaries discharged after Towton, swords were already being sharpened anew. For now, though, the realm believed in its deliverer. Edward's coronation that June was splendour without precedent. Fountains ran with wine, tapestries hung from every window, and the goldsmiths of Cheapside were said to have emptied their vaults for the crown. As he processed through the streets, sunlight caught the jewel upon his breast, the sun in splendour, and the people cried that heaven itself had blessed his reign. At 21, he stood on the threshold of greatness, handsome as legend, confident as youth. The blood of York had avenged its dead and claimed its inheritance. The red rose lay trampled in the snow, the white stood radiant against the summer sky. Still, history is rarely kind to perfection. The peace that followed Towton would not endure. No peace born of massacre ever can. In the glow of victory, the young ruler believed he had ended the struggle. In truth, he had only inherited its ghosts. For on the horizon, unseen and still distant, Margaret of Anjou was watching, and the woman who had outlived disgrace was not yet done with England. For the first time in a generation, the sound of swords faded. The land, long devoured by war, began to breathe again. New crops rose from fields once torn by hoofprints. Merchants returned to roads where only soldiers had marched. The young ruler had delivered what no monarch before him had managed. Victory followed by peace. Edward IV ruled like a man born for splendor. He had inherited not only his father's claim, but also a rare gift: the ability to make men forget the price of his triumphs. Where his predecessors had governed through fear or prayer, he ruled through charm. The tall figure with the golden hair and the easy smile became the emblem of renewal. Chroniclers spoke of his court as a place of music and silk, of tournaments and banquets that outshone the pageantry of France. The people called him the Good King, and for a brief span they almost believed it. At his side stood Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, whose hand had guided Edward to the throne. He was older, seasoned by a lifetime of intrigue, and commanded loyalty that rivaled royal authority. His estate stretched from the northern dales to the sea. His fleet guarded the channel, his word swayed the council. For 2 years they ruled in harmony, the energy of youth balanced by the experience of age. The realms seemed secure beneath their partnership. Still, peace is the most delicate of victories. Beneath the gold embroidery of Edward's reign, older wounds festered. The defeated lords of Lancaster smouldered in exile, their confiscated lands feeding the wealth of Yorkist allies. The clergy murmured that too much blood had been pardoned, too many sinners restored, and within the court itself, ambition, that faithful enemy, began its quiet work. Warwick had long dreamed of cementing the new dynasty with foreign alliance. His plan was elegant: to wed his young king to a French princess, binding peace with prestige. Negotiations with Louis XI advanced through secret channels. Couriers rode between Calais and Rouen, bearing gifts and coded letters. The match promised everything: dowry, security, legitimacy. Warwick's power at court would become unassailable. Then, without warning, Edward destroyed it all. In the spring of 1464, word reached the court that the monarch had married in secret. His bride was no princess, but a widow of minor nobility, Elizabeth Woodville, daughter of an obscure knight from Northamptonshire. The wedding had taken place months earlier, witnessed only by a priest, 2 ladies, and the rushes on the floor. The revelation struck like thunder. To Warwick, it was betrayal. His years of diplomacy turned to dust overnight. His prestige before the French court collapsed into ridicule. He had fashioned a king and been repaid with deceit. To the nobility, the match was little short of scandal. The new queen was a commoner, and worse, the daughter of a family that had fought for Lancaster. Even the ruler's own mother declared the union an insult to the blood of York, yet Edward refused to retreat. He presented Elizabeth to the council with a defiance that bordered on pride. Her beauty was undeniable: fair hair, grey eyes, and a composure that held even Warwick's glare. The courtiers bent the knee, some in obedience, others in calculation. Within months, her kin, the Woodvilles, began to rise. Her brothers married heiresses. Her sisters wed nobles twice their age. Her father became an earl. The royal court, once a circle of warriors and counsellors, filled with relatives of the queen. The old nobility murmured that the kingdom had been sold to a family of upstarts. Warwick, the architect of the dynasty, found himself edged from counsel by men who measured loyalty in kinship, not service. The merchants who had once toasted his name now sought favour through the queen's household. Bitterness, sharper than defeat, took root in him. Even abroad, the consequences were dire. The King of France, insulted by the broken marriage pact, turned toward the exiled Lancastrians. Across the Channel, Margaret of Anjou found refuge and fresh allies. She promised her son's hand to Warwick's cousin's daughter, hoping to lure the discontented earl into her cause. The game of alliances, once a chessboard of advantage, had become a snare. At home, Edward seemed oblivious. He hunted, feasted, and governed through charm. His confidence was radiant and reckless. When Parliament complained of new taxes, he reminded them that peace was cheaper than war. When his advisers urged caution, he laughed that a king must never act like a clerk. The charisma that had won him Towton now blinded him to the gathering storm. Meanwhile, Warwick's resentment matured into quiet conspiracy. He drew to him Edward's restless younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, ambitious, impulsive, and envious of his siblings' glory. The Kingmaker played on his vanity, hinting that fate might yet correct the mistake of birth. "The blood of York runs in more than one vein," he murmured. While those intrigues fermented, the royal court shone brighter than ever. Elizabeth Woodville presided with poise. Poets praised her as the English Venus. Her daughters, still children, dazzled visitors from Burgundy and Milan. The capital glittered with processions, tournaments, and masks. Yet even amid the splendor, a chill crept through the corridors. The Queen's family wielded influence with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Petitions that once reached Warwick's ear now ended in the hands of Woodville relatives. In the north, resentment burned hotter. Taxes to fund the royal pageants weighed heavily on households still rebuilding from war. The Nevilles, Warwick's kin, quarrelled with rival lords over confiscated estates. The peace Edward had built was turning brittle. In 1467, the breach between monarch and minister widened beyond repair. Warwick returned from France to find his advice openly mocked. Edward's alliance had shifted toward Burgundy, the old enemy of Louis XI. The new pact brought trade, but destroyed what remained of Warwick's foreign reputation. At a public audience, the Kingmaker's temper broke. He accused the Burgundians of deceit and the Woodvilles of greed. The ruler dismissed him with a smile that ended their friendship. It was not the first time a monarch had quarrelled with his chief noble, but never before had the balance of power been so perilous. Warwick still commanded the hearts of soldiers and sailors. His name was legend in every tavern. The Queen's family held titles, but no armies. The realm became a courtly battleground, one side wielding charm, the other loyalty. That summer, Edward attended the marriage of his sister Margaret to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. The ceremony, dazzling in its opulence, marked England's re-entry into European politics. Yet for every cheer abroad, there was a mutter at home. The people admired splendour, but distrusted its cost. Behind the banners and feasts, a question grew unspoken. Could a peace built on vanity survive the ambition of its builders? Warwick, withdrawn to his northern estates, began to answer that question in secret. He spoke to envoys from France, to lords discontented with Woodville arrogance, to Clarence, who dreamed of wearing a crown his brother did not deserve. Their letters passed by night, sealed with wax bearing neither rose. The golden age of Edward's reign was ending, though the king himself refused to see it. He believed charm could conquer betrayal as easily as battle, but charm is a frail shield against envy. The very grace that had once united the kingdom was now dividing it, half dazzled, half resentful. By the close of the decade, the Kingmaker had turned from counsellor to conspirator. In his halls at Middleham, messengers came and went beneath banners that no longer bore the sun in splendour. The same man who had made a king was preparing to unmake him. And far away in France, Margaret of Anjou, patient as winter, listened to every rumour. The realm that thought itself healed was beginning to sicken again, not from battle this time, but from pride. By the late 1460s, the bright reign that had begun in glory darkened into mistrust. The laughter of courtly banquets gave way to whispers behind chamber doors. The ruler's charm still dazzled his subjects, but among the nobles it bred unease. They saw a sovereign too confident to listen, too proud to fear, and too enamoured of his own good fortune to sense its decay. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, watched from his northern stronghold, measuring the distance between favour and exile. The man who had crowned a king now found himself treated as an ornament of a bygone war. The Woodvilles had taken his place at council. His council itself was ignored. Yet across the kingdom, his name still carried the weight of legend. Merchants trusted him, soldiers followed him. Common folk called him our Earl, a title warmer than loyalty to any monarch. It was Clarence, the king's restless brother, who first turned grievance into treason. Young, ambitious, and easily flattered, he let Warwick's words fall like sparks onto dry tinder. The ruler, the Earl told him, has forgotten the men who made him. Perhaps the crown would rest steadier on a wiser head. Whether he spoke in jest or prophecy, the younger prince believed him. The discontent ripened into plot. Across the shires, Warwick's agents spread tales of royal corruption, of taxes squandered on pageants, of merchants cheated by Woodville monopolies, of justice sold at court. The stories grew with each telling until rebellion seemed not treason but remedy. The first flames broke out in the north, where the Nevilles' banners were still revered. Villages rose behind cries of "God bless King Henry," a name not heard in triumph for years. In 1469, as summer ripened, Warwick struck. He summoned his retainers and marched south under the pretense of restoring order. Clarence rode beside him, now married to the Earl's daughter, Isabel. The Union sealed aboard ship in defiance of royal command. Their armies met near Banbury at Edgecote, where the king's forces, outnumbered and unprepared, broke beneath the assault. When the smoke cleared, Edward IV was a prisoner of his own cousin. For a moment, it seemed history had reversed itself. The king who had captured Henry at Northampton was now captive in turn. Warwick ruled through him, issuing decrees in the royal name, dismissing Woodville officials and restoring his own allies to power. Yet authority seized without legitimacy quickly curdles. The great lords, fearing the Earl's ambition, withdrew their support. Rebellions flared in Kent and Lincolnshire. Towns closed their gates to his emissaries. Within weeks, Warwick realized he had trapped himself. A captive monarch was less useful than a free one, and England would not bow to a nobleman, however mighty. Reluctantly, he released Edward under oath of pardon. The ruler rode back to London smiling, outwardly gracious, inwardly vengeful. Peace returned in name only. Clarence was forgiven in ceremony, but not in spirit. The Woodvilles reoccupied the court, their vengeance subtle and patient. Warwick, stripped of influence, withdrew again to his estates, where his halls filled with visitors who came not to flatter but to conspire. It was then that he turned toward the unthinkable: alliance with the house he had spent a decade destroying. Through envoys in France, he opened correspondence with Margaret of Anjou. The queen who had once called him traitor now recognized in him a tool of restoration. King Louis XI, ever eager to humble Burgundy, offered his blessing and his fleet. The negotiations were uneasy. Margaret distrusted the man who had slain her allies. Warwick loathed the woman who had mocked his victories. Yet both had learned that vengeance and necessity are often the same. At the court of Angers, they met in person, two exiles joined by ambition. The treaty that followed promised the return of Henry VI to the throne and the marriage of Warwick's younger daughter, Anne, to the Queen's son, Edward of Lancaster. So the Kingmaker became the Queen's champion. In September 1470, Warwick landed in Devon with a French-backed army. The South rose to greet him. The capital, disillusioned by royal extravagance, opened its gates without resistance. Edward fled westward. His small retinue pursued across the shires. In a desperate race for the coast, he escaped from King's Lynn with a handful of companions and found refuge in Burgundy. His brother Gloucester, faithful even in retreat, went with him. Meanwhile, in London, the Tower's gates swung open. The frail figure of Henry VI, grey, hollow-eyed, bewildered, was led through cheering crowds. 10 years of captivity had turned the saintly king into a shadow. Yet the people welcomed him as a symbol of conscience restored. Bells rang. Processions wound through streets that had once hailed his rival. At Westminster, the crown was placed again upon his head. Thus began what chroniclers would call the readeption, the brief return of the Lancastrian rule. Warwick, now titled Lieutenant of the Realm, governed in the king's name. Clarence stood beside him, discontent already visible in his restless gaze. The monarch, gentle as ever, spent his days in prayer, scarcely aware that his throne had been won and would soon be lost again. England, exhausted, obeyed. But beneath the calm ran deep unease. Those who had fought for York feared retribution. Those who had fought for Lancaster doubted the stability of a government led by ghosts. The Queen and her son remained in France, awaiting the Earl's signal to return. Warwick, aware of his fragile position, wrote to them in tones of deference that barely concealed impatience. In Burgundy, Edward IV prepared his answer. He had been received coldly by Duke Charles, who hesitated to provoke France by aiding him. But Burgundy was bound by marriage. The Duke's wife was Edward's sister, Margaret. Persuaded by her tears and his own rivalry with Louis, Charles released ships and coin. By March 1471, the exiled king sailed from Flushing with 2,000 men, a handful of nobles, and the certainty that luck favoured the bold. He landed on the Yorkshire coast in bitter weather. Few welcomed him. Even fewer expected him to survive. Yet fortune, as ever, proved his ally. Town after town opened its gates. Old veterans rejoined his standard. When he reached Warwick's stronghold at Coventry, he offered peace in exchange for allegiance. The gates stayed shut. Then came the turn no prophet could have foreseen. Clarence, unsettled and opportunistic, slipped away from Warwick's camp and rode to his brother's side. In a public ceremony, the two embraced, their quarrel forgotten or postponed. Edward's army swelled to near 10,000. By April, the two hosts met north of London in thick fog. At Barnet, before dawn, the armies clashed. Trumpets blared through the mist. Men fought against shadows they could barely see. Confusion turned brother against brother. Clarence's troops struck allies by mistake. When the sun broke through, Warwick was dead. Struck down amid the rout, his body stripped and left among the fallen. The Kingmaker, who had made and unmade kings, died as every soldier dies, unrecognized until the battle was done. The victory at Barnet restored Edward's throne, but not his peace. For even as the dead were buried, word came that Margaret had landed in the west with her son and a fresh army. The queen who had trusted Warwick's sword would now test her own fate. Once more the current of fate reversed, and England, battered but awake, stood ready for what was coming. The fog that lifted from the field of Barnet revealed a kingdom reborn through slaughter. Among the tangled dead lay Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, his armour torn, his face unrecognized. Around him, the bodies of men who had once sworn him loyalty sprawled in silence. The dawn that rose over their corpses was Edward's second sunrise as ruler, his throne regained not by right but by endurance. London received him with the weary relief of a city too often conquered. Bells tolled, prayers were offered, and the citizens hung garlands from their windows. Yet beneath the rejoicing lay unease. The monarch who entered Westminster that April was no longer the bright young victor of Towton, but a man tempered by exile, betrayal, and loss. He rode through the streets in armour, still dusted with the blood of his cousin, and those who looked upon him saw the shadow of a king who had learned that mercy is a luxury. He had little time to savour his triumph. Even as Warwick's body cooled, news reached the court that Queen Margaret had landed in the west with her son and a new army. The queen who had once ruled through fear was now guided by desperation. She had buried her husband's mind. She would not bury his cause. Edward moved swiftly. Within days he marched westward, leaving London under guard and taking with him every man who could bear arms. His brothers rode beside him. George of Clarence, reconciled once more, and Richard of Gloucester, the quiet younger sibling whose loyalty had never faltered. Rain fell without pause, turning the roads to rivers. Yet the soldiers followed, driven by the knowledge that this campaign would decide the future of the realm. Margaret's host advanced from the southwest, gathering reinforcements from the shires that still remembered Lancaster with pity. Her forces were led by the Duke of Somerset and Lord Wenlock, men of skill but little trust in one another. At their heart rode the young prince, Edward of Lancaster, 17 years old and aflame with purpose. Chroniclers wrote that he resembled his father in gentleness and his mother in fire. For Margaret, he was the embodiment of all that had been lost, and all that might yet be redeemed. The two armies converged near Tewkesbury in early May 1471. The town stood between forest and river, its fields wide and flat, a killing ground chosen by fate. Edward reached it first and took the high ground, fortifying his lines while his enemies approached through the narrow lanes. At dawn on the 4th, the battle began. The roar of artillery echoed across the meadows, mingled with the cries of the charging men. Somerset led a furious assault on the Yorkist right, breaking through the first ranks before being driven back by Gloucester's counterattack. His troops, trapped between hedges and bog, were slaughtered without mercy. When Somerset returned to his own lines and found Wenlock slow to aid him, he struck him down with his axe, one act of madness in a day already consumed by chaos. The fighting lasted less than 3 hours. Edward's discipline, sharpened by exile, proved decisive. When the rout began, the plain became a trap. Lancastrian soldiers fled toward the river, drowning as they tried to cross. Others sought sanctuary within the abbey. By midday, the field was his. The aftermath was merciless. The young prince was captured while fleeing the field. He was brought before Edward in a cottage near the abbey, still spattered with mud and blood. What passed between them has been told 100 ways. That the prince claimed the throne in defiance, that the king struck him, that his brothers and their men cut him down in rage. The truth, like mercy, did not survive the day. The heir of Lancaster lay dead before the sun set. That night, Somerset and the remaining commanders were dragged from sanctuary and executed. Their bodies were left hanging in the market square, a warning to all who would dream of restoration. The abbey itself reeked of death, its stone floors slick with blood that no blessing could wash away. News of the victory reached London within days. The capital celebrated as if the war were ended, which, in a sense, it was. The House of Lancaster had been broken utterly. Its heir was dead, its generals executed, its queen a prisoner. Henry VI, frail and bewildered, remained locked within the tower, a living relic of a vanished world. On May the 21st, Edward returned to the city. His troops paraded the captured banners through the streets. Warwick's standard hung beside that of Lancaster, symbols of treachery and defeat. The next morning, the king rode to the tower to view his last enemy. What words passed between them, none recorded. That night, the former ruler was found dead in his cell. Officially, grief had ended his life. Yet when the coffin was opened years later, bloodstains marred the skull. With Henry's death, the red rose withered at last. The war that had consumed a generation had no heir left to fight it. Margaret of Anjou, widowed in spirit long before in law, was sent to France, ransomed by a king who could afford generosity now that vengeance was complete. The court entered a new splendor. Edward's triumph was celebrated as divine justice, the righteous reward of courage and constancy. He rewarded his followers lavishly. Lands, titles, and offices flowed like wine. The lords who had doubted him now knelt willingly, for power has always been a persuasive creed. Yet victory carried its own shadows. The fields of Tewkesbury were littered with corpses too young to have chosen their loyalties. Families that had survived one war now found themselves without sons to till their estates. The air hung heavy with mourning, even as banners rose in celebration. In taverns and churches alike, people spoke of an endless cycle, a serpent devouring its tail. The monarch himself seemed altered. The jovial confidence of youth gave way to watchful gravity. He spoke less, trusted few, and worked tirelessly to restore order. "We have slain the dragon," he said once to his council, "but the smoke remains." To the south, merchants rejoiced as trade revived. To the north, the scars of rebellion never healed. Castles changed hands, but not hearts. In the quiet months that followed, the new peace felt more like exhaustion than reconciliation. Richard of Gloucester, the king's youngest brother, distinguished himself at Tewkesbury and became the ruler's most trusted lieutenant. Clarence, ever restless, grew jealous once more. Beneath the smooth surface of the restored court, old rivalries stirred, faintly at first, like embers beneath ash. Still, the ruler's position seemed unassailable. He had conquered his enemies twice and outlived every challenge. No foreign power dared test him. No pretender remained alive to oppose him. From Windsor to York, churches rang with Te Deum, as if the realm had been rebaptized. But the peace he forged was built upon graves. Every victory in the long war had carried its own prophecy of ruin, and Tewkesbury was no exception. The young king, who had once fought for order, now governed a nation haunted by its own memory. On the evening of Henry's death, thunder rolled across London. Chroniclers wrote that lightning struck the tower, shattering part of its roof. Superstitious or not, the citizens murmured that heaven itself had sighed, not in judgment, but in weariness. Edward ignored omens. He believed himself chosen by Providence, and for a while it seemed the heavens agreed. The red rose was gone, the white triumphant. Yet in that triumph lay the seed of complacency, and in complacency the beginning of decline. For though the War of the Roses appeared ended, its petals were still falling, one by one, unseen, into the years ahead. When the smoke of Tewkesbury cleared, the realm found itself ruled by a man who had turned survival into an art. Edward IV had fought 2 wars, been crowned twice, and outlived every rival. The blood of York now reigned unchallenged. Yet peace, like victory, must be managed. The years that followed were unlike any the kingdom had known for a century. The drums fell silent, the levies disbanded, and the great fortresses of the north lowered their drawbridges. Trade routes reopened, merchants returned to London with silks from Flanders and spices from Venice. After decades of ruin, wealth began to flow again. The ruler, who had once commanded armies, now governed with the precision of a merchant prince. He set about restoring order, not through terror, but through prosperity. Taxes were reduced, customs reformed, and foreign merchants courted with generosity. The goldsmiths of Cheapside swore that under Edward, coin seemed to multiply of its own accord. The court glittered, not merely with jewels, but with confidence. The monarch himself embodied his age, pragmatic, charming, and unabashedly worldly. He delighted in the company of merchants as much as of nobles, understanding that money was a subtler weapon than steel. Where his predecessors had prayed or plotted, he calculated. Yet calculation can be a lonely virtue. In private, Edward was a man of appetite. He ate well, drank deeply, loved many, and forgave easily. His generosity was both a gift and a danger. Those who betrayed him often found themselves welcomed back with a smile, for he believed loyalty could be purchased as surely as land. It worked until it didn't. The Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, thrived in this new order. Her family, once despised as parvenus, had woven itself into every level of governance. Her brothers held high offices, her sisters married great lords, and her mother, Jacquetta, was revered as matriarch of a dynasty that seemed destined to endure. Yet every rise breeds resentment. The older nobility, still proud of ancient names, watched the Woodvilles with silent fury. Foremost among the discontented was George, Duke of Clarence. The middle brother, too proud to be content and too insecure to be loyal, found himself adrift. His reconciliation with the crown after Warwick's fall had brought him lands and honours, but not peace. He brooded over slights imagined and real, whispering that his blood was as royal as his brother's. Clarence's envy was fed by strange rumours. A prophecy had spread that the king's heirs would fall by one whose name begins with G. The jest began at court, but Clarence took it as destiny. He surrounded himself with astrologers, conspirators, and malcontents, many of whom still grieved the destruction of Lancaster. Among them he found comfort and danger. The ruler, perhaps blinded by affection, indulged him. He hoped that tolerance would breed gratitude. Instead, it bred audacity. In 1477, Clarence was implicated in a plot to undermine the succession, accused of spreading rumours that the king's children were illegitimate. When his servants were tried for treason, he interrupted the proceedings with protests of innocence so loud they drowned the verdict. The monarch's patience, long tested, broke. Clarence was arrested and brought before Parliament, which condemned him by act rather than trial. a gesture both merciful and absolute. The sentence was death. Chroniclers wrote that the ruler wept as he signed the order. Others claimed he did not hesitate. In February 1478, the Duke met his end within the tower. Legend insists he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a punishment chosen either for its cruelty or its wit. Whatever the truth, his death served its purpose. The blood of York had consumed itself once more, and the crown rested heavier on Edward's head. After Clarence's execution, the monarch devoted himself to consolidation. The treasury swelled, justice was administered with efficiency unknown since the days of the Plantagenets. The ruler's personal fortune grew vast enough to rival the income of his predecessors combined. He built palaces, funded ships, and patronized scholars. To many, his reign appeared the dawn of a golden age, a time when strength had finally married reason. Even so, the peace of the Yorkists was not a peace of reconciliation, only of exhaustion. The noble houses nursed memories sharper than swords. The countryside still bore the scars of war. Villages abandoned, manors half ruined, graveyards filled with unnamed dead. The appearance of calm masked a deep weariness, a sense that the age itself had been drained of purpose. In France, Louis XI watched the ruler's prosperity with envy and unease. To contain him, the French king encouraged intrigues within the court, financing disaffected nobles and whispering doubts into willing ears. Across the Channel, plots multiplied like weeds in spring. Within the kingdom, the ruler's own health began to falter. Years of indulgence had thickened his frame and clouded his once clear eyes. He still hunted, still laughed, but the energy that had driven him from Towton to Tewkesbury waned. By the early 1480s, he appeared older than his 40 years. The death of trusted advisers deepened his melancholy. His youngest brother, Richard of Gloucester, governed the north with diligence. His queen managed the court with elegance. Yet the ruler himself grew introspective, as though sensing time shortening around him. The court, however, refused to see decay. Pageants continued, ambassadors were received with splendor, and London gleamed. Beneath that brilliance, alliances shifted. Ambitious men studied the faces of the royal children, wondering who might rule next, and through whom power might flow. In those final years, the ruler's greatest triumph was invisibly political. He had made monarchy seem stable again. After half a century of chaos, the idea of kingship itself had been restored. His sons were young, his daughters numerous, his queen beloved by the people. It seemed the crown had at last found permanence. But permanence is the cruelest illusion history offers. On the night of April the 9th, 1483, Edward IV died at Westminster, suddenly and without warning. Some said fever, others whispered of overindulgence. He left behind a widow, 2 young princes, and a nation stunned by the loss of the man who had made it believe in peace. The next morning, the bells that had once rung for victory tolled again, this time for uncertainty. The realm that had lived too long by the sword was about to test whether it could live without one. The death of Edward IV came like a blow struck in sleep, sudden, soundless, and irreversible. One day he presided over council, laughing at some bawdy tale. The next, he lay pale upon his bed at Westminster, his pulse fading beneath the physician's touch. He was not yet 41. The courtiers who gathered around him refused to believe it. The monarch who had survived battle, exile, and treachery could not possibly be undone by his own body. Yet the breath rattled, the colour drained, and the man who had remade the realm slipped into silence. The bells that had once rung for his triumph tolled again, low and uncertain. From London Bridge to the Abbey, people whispered the same question. Who would rule now? The ruler had left two sons, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, a boy of 9, both legitimate, both beloved. But youth in a court full of ambition is a dangerous inheritance. At the moment of his death, the kingdom was still. The treasury was full, the borders secure, the nobility subdued. Yet that very calm concealed its peril. A realm at peace becomes a battlefield the moment its master's hand falls away. Edward's final act had been to name his brother, Richard of Gloucester, protector of the realm, until the eldest son reached maturity. Few objected. Gloucester was respected, loyal, pious, and incorruptible, in an age that scarcely believed such a thing existed. He had governed the north with discipline and justice, earning the loyalty of soldiers and merchants alike. To many, he seemed the natural guardian for a fragile dynasty, but others saw the moment differently. The Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, widowed without warning, looked upon her husband's death and saw danger. Her enemies still filled the council. Her family's influence, resented for years, would not survive without the monarch's protection. Her first instinct was not mourning, but preservation. Before dawn on April the 12th, she sent word to her brother, Earl Rivers, to secure her eldest son in the fortress at Ludlow. The boy king, Edward V, was proclaimed in the marketplace that same day. Trumpets sounded, but the music was hollow. From her sanctuary in Westminster, the Queen ordered her relatives to raise escorts and bring the child safely to the capital. Meanwhile, in the north, Gloucester received the news of his brother's death with grief and suspicion. Reports from London suggested that the Woodvilles meant to crown the young king at once, excluding him from his rightful guardianship. To the new protector, it was not ambition that drove him, but duty, to keep the crown untainted by faction. He gathered his retainers and rode south. The two parties met on the road near Stony Stratford. The encounter was courteous on its surface, deadly beneath. Gloucester embraced his nephew, greeted Rivers with measured warmth, and then, at a signal, arrested the Queen's brother and her eldest son by her first marriage. The boy king, bewildered, was informed that he would continue to London under his uncle's care. The royal escort, suddenly leaderless, obeyed. When the cortege reached the capital, the city breathed easier. Gloucester's reputation reassured them. The Woodvilles' greed had made them despised. Yet within the abbey, the Queen collapsed in tears. She fled with her daughters into sanctuary, convinced that she and her sons were next. From behind barred doors, she demanded the release of her kin. None came. The protector governed in the boy's name with quiet authority. He dismissed corrupt officials, restored discipline, and promised a coronation for midsummer. The council, half grateful and half fearful, endorsed his actions. Even his enemies admitted that his rule was orderly. But rumour, once stirred, travels faster than decree. Whispers crept through the taverns and along the docks that the Queen's kin had been executed without trial, that the boy king was a prisoner, that Gloucester intended the throne for himself. None dared say it openly, but the thought spread like mildew in still air. In early June, the council met at the Tower. Gloucester entered in full armour, though peace reigned. He addressed them gravely, accusing the Woodvilles of plotting his death and corrupting the succession. Several councillors fled that night and were never seen again. The next morning, new warrants were issued. Rivers and his companions were tried at Pontefract and beheaded. London awoke to proclamations declaring that the protector had acted for the safety of the crown. Yet the crown itself now seemed a phantom. The coronation was delayed, the boy and his brother were lodged within the tower for their protection. The queen, still in sanctuary, sent letters imploring her eldest to be crowned swiftly, but her messengers were turned away. The city began to murmur. The protector, once the paragon of loyalty, now held both heirs in confinement. His supporters insisted it was necessity. His critics called it design. On the 22nd of June, a preacher named Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross that changed the air entirely. He declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the late king, before wedding her, had pledged himself to another woman. If true, every child of that union was illegitimate. The claim, shocking in its brazenness, was said to rest upon sworn testimony. Few believed it, yet fewer dared protest. Within a week, the council petitioned Gloucester to accept the crown as the rightful heir of York. He hesitated, or appeared to. Then, with solemn reluctance, he agreed. On July the 6th, 1483, he was crowned Richard III in Westminster Abbey. The streets filled with cheers, rehearsed more than felt. The new ruler swore to protect the laws, honor the dead, and guard the peace. But behind the jubilation, unease gathered like thunder. The princes, Edward V and his brother, Richard of York, did not appear at the ceremony. They remained in the tower, glimpsed now and then at the windows, then no more. Through that summer, the whispers grew. Some claimed the boys were seen playing in the gardens. Others swore the windows had been boarded up. The Queen, still in sanctuary, sent gifts and prayers that never reached them. By autumn, no one could say with certainty whether the heirs lived or died. From the throne came words of denial, stamped with the new king's seal. He spoke of loyalty, justice, and divine will, yet suspicion clung to him like shadow to flame. To those who had served his brother, his rule felt not renewal, but reckoning. The peace of the Yorkists had ended where it had begun, with family devouring family. The crown that Edward IV had secured in war was now stained by the silence of children. The question that haunted London's nights was simple and terrible. What had become of the princes? No answer came, and in the absence of truth, fear became its own gospel. Heavy silence settled upon the land in the summer of 1483. The streets of London shimmered with heat, yet the capital seemed colder than ever. No bells rang, no laughter echoed in the markets. People spoke in lowered voices, afraid that even sound might carry accusation. 2 boys had vanished from their tower, and a nation held its breath. The new monarch had been crowned scarcely a month, but already his reign bore the weight of unease. Richard III moved through his court with measured courtesy, addressing nobles by name, rewarding loyalty, and proclaiming justice. Yet every act of mercy only sharpened the memory of those not present. The young Edward V and his brother had disappeared into the walls meant to protect them. At first, their absence was explained as prudence. The tower, said the heralds, was a fortress as well as a palace. The princes would remain there until unrest subsided. But as summer turned to autumn and the palace windows remained dark, explanations grew brittle. Servants whispered of guards dismissed, of torches burning at strange hours, of chamber doors never opened again. No bodies were found, none were needed. Rumour filled the void where truth had died. Richard himself gave no sign of guilt. To his followers, he was the model of discipline, a ruler who rose before dawn, attended mass, and worked tirelessly for reform. He abolished exploitative fines, curbed corruption, and restored lands unjustly taken. Even his enemies admitted his competence. Yet behind every decree lingered the question he could not escape. What had become of his brother's sons? His defenders argued that the accusation was absurd. Why would a man who had risked his soul to protect the crown now stain it with blood? His detractors answered with a simpler logic, that ambition, once fed, is never sated. Between those two arguments lay the fragile line of his legitimacy. In the shires, rebellion stirred. The first to move was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, the very noble who had helped place Richard upon the throne. Disappointed of reward or seized by conscience, he turned suddenly against his sovereign. That autumn, he raised the banner of revolt in the west, proclaiming for the exiled Henry Tudor, the last faint heir of Lancaster through the Beaufort line. The rebellion failed almost as swiftly as it began. Torrential rains flooded the Severn, trapping Buckingham's forces. He was captured, tried, and executed in the courtyard of Salisbury Castle. His death should have restored security, yet it deepened the unease. If even the king's maker could turn, who could be trusted? From exile in Brittany, Henry Tudor watched and planned. His claim to the throne was tenuous, descended from John of Gaunt through a legitimized but barred line. Yet it offered something England craved, an end to division. The red rose and the white had bled each other dry. A new banner might heal both wounds. In Tudor's camp gathered exiles, outlaws, and idealists, bound not by certainty, but by hope. Within the court, Richard faced a loneliness deeper than rebellion. His queen, Anne Neville, Warwick's daughter, the last remnant of a once mighty house, had grown frail. Their only child, Edward of Middleham, sickened and died in 1484. The boy's brief life extinguished like the lineage itself. Chroniclers wrote that when the news reached the ruler, he locked himself in prayer for hours, emerging grey and aged. The crown had cost him everything it was meant to protect. Still, he ruled on. Parliament confirmed his reforms. Judges praised his justice. Envoys described a sovereign as diligent as any in Europe. But admiration could not drown suspicion. The shadow of the missing princes stretched longer with each passing season. Foreign courts murmured of it, poets hinted at it, commoners turned their prayers into questions. The next year, the king summoned his court to Nottingham for Easter. He spoke of loyalty and divine purpose, declaring that the kingdom would not again fall into chaos. Yet even as he spoke, word came that Henry Tudor was preparing a fleet. France, eager to weaken England, had supplied gold and men. The exiles were gathering along the Breton coast, and the red dragon of Cadwallader, symbol of ancient Welsh kings, had been raised beside the red rose. The ruler's councillors urged swift action, preemptive strikes, new taxes, mass arrests. Richard refused. He believed in order, not terror. If I am to lose this crown, he told them, let it not be for fear. Through the summer of 1485, the two destinies drew closer, one seasoned by experience, the other driven by prophecy. Richard had the army, the treasury, and the throne. Tudor had the wind, the sea, and a story that people wanted to believe. As August approached, the exiles set sail. A storm scattered them, but the flagship reached the Welsh coast intact. Henry Tudor, pale and cautious, disembarked near Milford Haven. From there he began his march east, gathering men as he went. In the valleys of Wales, the prophecy of redemption spread like fire, that a prince of Welsh blood would reclaim the island from tyranny. The shepherds and miners who joined him cared little for lineage. They wanted an end. In London, the king heard the news without alarm. He had defeated greater armies. He would defeat this one. He called his lords to muster and rode north to Leicester, the banners of York trailing behind him in disciplined splendor. Chroniclers said he carried himself with a calm beyond courage, as if his will alone might bind the realm again. Before dawn, on August the 21st, he took communion and made his confession. His priest later recalled that he spoke no fear for himself, only for the peace of his kingdom. That evening, he dined with his captains, predicting that within a day he would hang the traitor Henry's body from the walls of London. Outside, rain began to fall, light, relentless, indifferent. When the sun rose over Bosworth Field the next morning, two armies faced one another across mist and mud. The fate of a generation stood between them. But that story belongs to the next part. When prophecy met exhaustion and the crown itself rolled in blood, it began, as revolutions often do, with letters written in secret and carried by women. While kings fought with armies, Margaret Beaufort fought with ink, coin, and silence. From her manor at Woking, she spun a web that reached from London's guild halls to the far harbours of Brittany. Her son Henry, the last thread of Lancaster's blood, was across the sea, patient, careful, waiting for a sign. She would give him one. Margaret had survived every turn of fortune the wars could offer. She had been a girl mother, a widow, and twice a pawn in political games she never intended to play. But she had learned that power rarely wears armor. Her letters, written in a small, disciplined hand, promised support to the exiles, gifts to those who could be bought, and prayers to those who could not. Few guessed that the woman who hosted masses and embroidered altar cloths was weaving rebellion beneath her rosary. In Brittany, Henry Tudor lived the quiet life of a man pretending not to dream. His claim to the throne was thin as parchment, descending from John of Gaunt's legitimized Beaufort line, barred by law yet sanctified by endurance. What gave it weight was not law, but exhaustion. England had spent 30 years bleeding itself dry. The people were ready to believe in a name that might close the wound. When news reached him that Richard III's popularity had curdled into fear, Henry began to gather allies. Exiled Yorkists, men who had fought against Lancaster all their lives, now pledged to him, believing that peace might be safer under a stranger than under the king who had silenced his nephews. From Brittany, he wrote to Margaret, addressing her as "my most dear mother and chief comforter." She answered with coded blessings and practical advice. When to sail, whom to trust, where discontent ran deepest. Through the winter of 1484, the conspiracy ripened. French gold arrived quietly in Breton ports. Captains were hired. Priests offered absolution to soldiers who swore that this time they fought not for faction, but for England itself. Henry knew better than to trust their motives, but he trusted their fatigue. Across the Channel, Richard prepared as well. He reinforced coastal garrisons and sent spies abroad, yet even his informants returned with more rumour than certainty. The rebellion was no longer confined to a party. It had become a faith. It whispered that the time of tyranny was ending, that the roses would finally bloom together. In the taverns of Kent and the manors of Wales, men began to polish their swords again. By early August 1485, the wind turned favourable. Henry's ships, small and weather-beaten, slipped from the Breton coast under cover of night. The fleet was fragile, barely 30 vessels, but his faith was stubborn. Among his companions were John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, an old soldier of Lancaster, and Jasper Tudor, his uncle, who had spent half a lifetime in exile. Their destination was Milford Haven, where Welsh kinship and legend might lend them strength. On the 19th, the ships made landfall. The men kissed the sand and blessed the grey hills that rose behind the harbour. From there, the army began its slow march eastward, a pilgrimage more than a campaign. Welsh lords joined as they passed. Rhys ap Thomas with his disciplined retainers, and others drawn by prophecy. In the valleys, the bards recited an ancient promise that a son of Wales would redeem the island from chaos. The red dragon flew beside the red rose. Each mile brought new recruits. Farmers left their ploughs. Miners traded picks for spears. Henry rode among them quietly, his face composed, his eyes watchful. He was not a warrior by nature, cautious where others were daring, deliberate where others were reckless. Yet he possessed the one quality England now craved: patience. As the host advanced, Richard's messengers galloped north with news of the landing. The king was at Nottingham when word reached him. He received it without visible alarm. "If they come," he said, "we will meet them on the field." Orders were sent to muster every loyal household. Within a week, his army numbered over 12,000. Meanwhile, Henry's force, scarcely half that size, moved steadily through the Midlands, shadowed by scouts. Yet the exiles carried an advantage their enemy lacked: belief. They marched beneath the banner of both roses entwined, white and red together, and men along the road crossed themselves at the sight. The symbols suggested not conquest, but union, and after decades of division, that was a miracle greater than victory. In London, Margaret Beaufort waited, her household outwardly serene. She entertained visiting clerics, endowed charities, and kept a candle burning in her chapel day and night. No one who entered her hall would have guessed that she received messages in cipher, that she paid for every loaf of bread sent to the Tudor camp, that she prayed not only for her son's safety, but for his coronation. Richard III, for his part, still believed fortune favoured him. He was an able commander, brave and decisive, and his troops were seasoned. Yet in his own camp lingered doubt, not open treachery, but hesitation. Among his captains were Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his brother William, both bound to him by oath, but to Margaret by blood. The Stanleys commanded thousands and were kin to Henry through her second marriage. Their loyalty would decide the war. As the two armies drew near, messengers rode between them, Stanley's men to Henry, pledging help but urging patience. "When the moment comes," they promised, "we shall act." Henry could only trust them, for his life depended upon their word. By August the 21st, the two hosts had closed to within sight of each other, near the village of Bosworth. Mist lay over the fields, and the air smelt of rain. Henry camped upon a low ridge, Richard on the higher ground beyond. Between them, the Stanleys waited, unmoving, the greatest force in England holding its breath. That night, Henry walked among his soldiers. He spoke little, thanking them for their loyalty, reminding them that tomorrow's battle was not for vengeance, but for peace. Chroniclers say he slept soundly. Richard did not. He paced his tent until dawn, reading omens in the flicker of the candle flame. When morning came, the sky was leaden. Drums rolled through the fog. The last act of the Wars of the Roses was about to begin. Dawn broke over Bosworth, like the unveiling of judgment. Mist clung to the fields, veiling the marshes and low ridges in a ghostly shroud. To the north, Richard III's banners stirred in the weak wind, the white boar of York rampant upon crimson, while across the vale, Henry Tudor's smaller host gathered beneath the twin emblems of Red Dragon and Red Rose. Between them, the Stanleys waited on a third rise, unmoving, their thousands watching like an undecided god. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. For 30 years, the land had drunk blood from every lineage. Now it was to drink the last. At sunrise, the king rode the line of his army, calling his captains by name. "God and Saint George," he cried, will bring us victory this day." His voice carried pride and fury in equal measure. Around him shimmered a forest of spears, banners glinting through the mist. He was still the warrior of Barnet and Tewkesbury, lean, fierce, certain of destiny. He wore a circlet of gold above his helmet, a symbol and a challenge. On the opposite ridge, Henry Tudor stood watching, quiet among his captains. He was no match for his enemy in numbers or experience. Yet there was a calmness about him that unnerved even veterans. The son of exile had become a vessel of providence. His followers saw in him not a man, but a chance for ending. He gave few orders. "We march when the ground clears," he said, "and we fight for England, not for revenge." When the sun lifted fully, the horns sounded. Richard's cannon roared, their thunder rolling across the marshes. Arrows hissed through the haze, and the two armies surged forward. From both ridges, the men descended into a chaos of smoke and shouting. Lances shattered, blades caught, banners vanished in the whirl. The air reeked of sweat and iron. For the first hour, fortune favoured the crown. Richard's vanguard, larger and better armoured, drove Tudor's men backward. The king's archers loosed with precision, their shafts darkening the sky. Henry's left flank wavered, his standard-bearer was struck down. Through the noise and dust, the commander on the hill could see his own lines folding inward, like cloth in fire. Yet still the Stanleys held their ground. Neither side dared provoke them. The brothers commanded more men than either army. Their loyalty would determine the day. The ruler sent a herald demanding their immediate aid. Lord Stanley replied that his soldiers were not yet in array. The answer sealed his fate. As the fight raged, Henry saw that only a bold stroke could decide the field. He spurred his horse and rode toward the Stanleys' position, intending to join them or die trying. His small escort followed, the red dragon snapping in the wind. From the ridge, Richard saw the movement and understood its meaning instantly. "I will end this at once," he shouted. Gathering a handful of knights, he lowered his lance and charged. The ground shook beneath the hooves as the last true cavalry charge of medieval England began. Straight through the melee he rode, cutting down foes, scattering ranks, striking for the banner that bore his enemy's sign. Chroniclers said he slew Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard-bearer, with his own hand. For a moment, it seemed the crown itself would crush rebellion. Then the Stanleys moved. From their ridge, they descended like a tide, their spears glittering in the light. They fell upon the king's flank with sudden ferocity, striking from behind the very army they had pretended to serve. The royal line buckled, panic spread. Surrounded and outnumbered, Richard fought on, refusing retreat. "Treason!" he cried. "Treason! Treason!" Those were his last words. His horse stumbled in the mire, throwing him to the ground. Alone and on foot, he fought until he was overwhelmed, his blows still deadly even as he fell beneath them. When the fight ended, the body of England's last Plantagenet lay trampled in the mud, the crown torn from his head. A soldier found the circlet among the reeds and carried it to Henry Tudor. In that instant, the war that had devoured generations ended, not with proclamation or treaty, but with the placing of metal upon a man's brow. On the field itself, Lord Stanley knelt and set the crown upon Henry's head. "God save King Henry," he said, and the words rippled through the ranks like absolution. Silence followed, the kind that comes after thunder. The dead lay thick, the marsh water red around them. The victors stood stunned, unable to grasp that 3 decades of hatred had been decided in a single hour. Richard's body was stripped and slung across a horse. carried to Leicester for burial without ceremony. The chroniclers recorded that his corpse was displayed in public to prove that the tyrant was gone. His enemies called him usurper. His admirers mourned a brave man undone by fate. History would argue over him forever. As dusk fell, Henry rode to the edge of the field and looked out over the valley. The banners of both roses hung limp in the evening air. Around him, the survivors moved among the wounded, searching for friends, stripping the fallen, muttering prayers. He said little. When asked for orders, he answered simply, "Let the dead have peace. We must build anew." That night, torches burned along the ridges as burial began. The moon rose, silvering the armor of the slain. Somewhere in the darkness, the last echoes of battle drifted away like smoke. The next morning, the new king set out for London. Along the road, villagers knelt as he passed, uncertain whether to cheer or cross themselves. He rode beneath a makeshift canopy of branches, the crown resting awkwardly on his head, too large for the man who wore it. He did not smile. At the city gates, trumpets sounded, and the bells that had tolled for so many deaths rang this time for a beginning. The red rose of Lancaster and the white of York would soon be joined in one emblem, their petals merged by necessity more than forgiveness. The long war was over, but its ghost still followed close behind. After Bosworth's storm, the morning arrived dry and still. The valley lay silent beneath a pale sun, as though the earth itself had exhaled. Among the churned mud and trampled grass, the crown of England had been found and placed upon a stranger's head. Henry Tudor rode away from the field, a victor, but his victory was more inheritance than triumph, a burden disguised as salvation. The march to London was slow. Along the roads, peasants knelt, uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. The new ruler's banners bore both roses intertwined, white and red together, and that image, simple and miraculous, travelled faster than any herald. People who had grown weary of choosing sides began to hope that perhaps the roses might finally bloom upon one stem. When Henry entered the capital, the bells that had tolled for war rang instead for deliverance. The city decked its streets in crimson and ivory cloth. Merchants scattered coins from windows. Priests lined the route with crosses raised high. Yet beneath the celebration lay caution. England had seen too many saviors become tyrants, too many dawns end in blood. In Westminster, Henry was crowned on October 30th, 1485. He knelt before the altar, the crown that had rolled in the mud now gleaming above his brow. No rival claimed it, no council disputed it. For the first time in a generation, the throne was unchallenged. But his authority still rested on sand. To secure it, he needed to transform victory into lineage. He knew precisely how. In the early months of 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of the late Edward IV. The union was both strategy and symbol, the merging of the white and the red, the reconciliation of two dynasties that had spent 30 years destroying each other. Chroniclers wrote that when the couple processed through London, people wept as if witnessing a miracle. Above them, new banners fluttered, showing a single bloom. The Tudor rose, half crimson, half white. The Queen carried herself with quiet grace, aware that her marriage ended a war, but began a dynasty. The old nobility, bound now by blood to their former enemies, bent the knee in public and schemed in private. Peace never comes freely to those raised in suspicion. Henry's rule was cautious, meticulous, and unsparing. Where Edward had governed through splendor, the new monarch ruled through calculation. Every noble was audited, every bond recorded, every oath renewed. His council chamber became a ledger of loyalties. Mercy he offered sparingly. Rebellion he crushed before it drew breath. Yet beneath the sternness lay conviction. The island would never again be ruled by faction. For all his austerity, he understood theatre. His progress through the shires was choreographed like liturgy, the pious king restoring the realm. When he entered York, the very city that had once paraded his enemy's head upon its gates, he was greeted with hymns and cheers. He forgave, but he did not forget. Still, the ghosts of the roses refused to rest. In 1487, a boy named Lambert Simnel appeared in Ireland claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, a nephew of Edward IV said to have escaped the Tower. The rebellion drew support from Yorkist exiles and foreign mercenaries, their hopes rising like smoke. Henry met them at Stoke Field and crushed them utterly. The boy, discovered to be a baker's apprentice, was spared and set to work in the royal kitchens, a mercy both genuine and political. A decade later came Perkin Warbeck, bold, handsome, and persuasive, pretending to be the lost Prince Richard of York. He found sympathizers in Scotland and Burgundy, even admirers among English lords who longed for the old blood. For years he wandered Europe, a ghost with a crown. When he was finally captured, Henry paraded him through London, so that all could see how thin a lie ambition makes. Warbeck was hanged at Tyburn. The last echo of York's defiance died with him. Through such trials, the Tudor power hardened. By the century's end, the treasury overflowed. The nobles were leashed by debt, and the monarch's word had become law. The throne that had once been a prize of battle was now a fortress of bureaucracy. Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother, watched it all with quiet triumph. The woman who had plotted rebellion in whispers now governed her son's conscience with prayer. Her shadow stretched across the new age like benediction and warning. When she died in 1509, they said the bells tolled for the end of the wars, as much as for her soul. Elizabeth of York, serene and loyal, gave her husband heirs, Arthur, Henry, Margaret, Mary, the living guarantee of peace. In her face, people said, the bloodlines of Lancaster and York had blended so perfectly that they could no longer be told apart. When she walked through Westminster, children scattered petals before her, murmuring that the roses had at last become one. Still, peace, even when achieved, is never pure. Beneath the splendor of the new dynasty lay the memory of all that had been lost, fathers, brothers, sons, whole generations consumed by the quarrel of cousins. The abbeys that lined the roads were crowded with the tombs of men who had fought for righteousness and died for politics. In 1497, when Cornish miners rose against new taxes, Henry sent troops to crush them before they reached London. The rebels were peasants, not nobles, yet their defiance stirred unease. The crown's strength had become absolute, but the people had begun to wonder whether peace was worth its cost. Still, the island prospered. Trade grew, laws were enforced, and foreign rulers treated England with respect. The monarch who had landed with 2,000 men now commanded the loyalty of millions. When he died in 1509, he left to his son not a battlefield, but a kingdom. And to history, a lesson written in blood and caution, that power endures only when fear and hope walk hand in hand. At his funeral, courtiers remarked that the flowers upon his coffin were roses of every colour, their petals intermingled until no one could tell where white ended and red began. The wars had ended not in victory, but in balance, a fragile, necessary equilibrium between memory and mercy. The roses had united, but the thorns remained. And in that uneasy peace, England stepped from the medieval world into the modern age, a nation reborn from its own ruin, and a story that would, centuries later, inspire legends of dragons, thrones, and crowns won at terrible cost.